The sharp thud of the glass hitting the table cut through the laughter like a bolt of lightning striking the sky. Eyes turned, one by one, to the source of the gesture, expecting some impatient comment, perhaps a new provocation. But what they found was silence. A firm silence charged with something the elite present seemed to have forgotten how to recognize: true authority. At the central table, sitting with an imposing posture and a fixed gaze, was Seo Jun-ha, the youngest and most influential CEO in Korea's investment sector, a name that made reporters shushed and investors bow. Until then, he had remained discreet, following the business meeting with his usual reserved expression. But at that moment, his look said it all. He had not just watched the humiliation, he had felt it. As Yunji struggled to hide her tears and retreated with wounded dignity, he slowly stood up, with a calmness that seemed to draw the tension from the room like a magnet. The waiter, realizing who the approaching man was, paled. The laughter ceased completely. Even the cutlery rested on the plates. Without taking his eyes off Yunji, Seo Jun-ha walked to the center of the restaurant. In an unexpected gesture, he took his wallet from his pocket and placed several cards on the counter, saying loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I want the entire bill for the night paid, for every table. On one condition, no one here will ever forget what happened today." And then, turning to Eun-ji, he extended his hand naturally, unhurriedly, as if inviting someone to a better destination. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to go out with you. Now." Her hands trembled, but not from shame, but from disbelief. She accepted. And as they walked hand in hand out of that temple of arrogance, every eye in sight knew the game had changed. But what motivated this CEO to intervene so publicly? And what was still hidden behind that unlikely gesture that night? If you enjoy heart-touching stories and unexpected twists that make your heart race, subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you don't miss any episode. As that enigmatic gaze remained fixed on her, Yunji's world seemed to spin in slow motion. And it was in that instant, when the silence of the room weighed more heavily than any cruel words, that her mind retreated from that luxurious restaurant, as if seeking strength in old memories, in that which had shaped every piece of her history. Yunji was born in Incheon, in a small wooden house near the harbor, where the smell of fresh fish mingled with the wet clothes her mother washed for neighbors in exchange for a few cents. Her father had passed away too soon, leaving only an old photograph and debts the family could never pay off. Since then, Yunji had learned to be her mother's right-hand woman, helping her hang out clothes, mend tears, and cook simple rice so they could both survive. As a child, she didn't experience expensive toys or vacations, but she did have something that sustained her. Her mother's gentle voice repeating night after night that dignity is the greatest treasure that no one can steal. These words engraved themselves on the girl's heart, becoming an invisible shield against every scornful look she faced on the streets when wearing patched clothes or carrying baskets of dirty laundry. Even growing up amidst poverty, Yunji had always dreamed of becoming a fashion designer. She enjoyed looking at discarded fashion magazines, which she collected near downtown stores, and envisioned clothes that combined beauty and simplicity. With improvised thread and rusty needles, she created dresses for rag dolls. Each creation was a reminder that her dreams, though distant, were still alive. Upon graduating from high school, Yunji couldn't afford to enter a prestigious university in Seoul, like so many of her peers. Instead, she found work in a small sewing workshop, where she spent hours bent over cheap fabrics, learning how to transform scraps of cloth into something usable. There, between thread snips and needle-punched fingers, she kept the flame of hope alive. One day, she would have her own brand, something that would show the world that even humble places could give birth to beauty. In her rare moments of rest, she would stroll the bustling streets of Seoul, dreaming of entering high-end stores, trying on clothes she'd only seen in distant shop windows, and feeling part of a world that seemed reserved only for the privileged. And it was precisely this desire to experience, even just once, the taste of luxury that led her to the Gangnam restaurant that night, a simple gesture that would ultimately become a turning point. Her eyes filled with memories, and behind her fragile posture lay a strength no one there seemed to see. Little did they know that the girl they called Trash carried within her a story of struggle, resilience, and dignity that no amount of money could erase. And as she stood up, ready to leave the restaurant without imagining what was still about to happen, that mysterious gaze remained on her, loaded with intentions that would soon change her life forever. The gaze that followed Yunji wasn't one of disdain or mockery, but of something much deeper, almost hidden, behind the firm expression of a man who seemed to carry the weight of daily decisions that affected thousands of people. He sat at a discreet table, away from the spotlight, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, his tie perfectly adjusted, and his erect posture bespoke discipline. At first glance, he might have been just another successful executive, but there was something in the way he observed the room that set him apart from the rest. He didn't just see people, he saw intentions, details, stories hidden in every gesture. His name was Han Jae-hyun, one of Korea's most influential CEOs, known for his cold-blooded business dealings and ability to transform any company into an empire. Few there noticed his presence, and those who did preferred to keep their distance, fearing crossing the invisible line that separated the common world from that man of power. Yet at that moment, Jae-hyun wasn't interested in contracts, figures, or alliances. His eyes were fixed on the scene of a young woman being crushed by the cruelty of an entire hall. He remained silent, simply watching as the laughter echoed like sharp knives. Every cruel word directed at Yunji seemed to resonate within him, awakening a rare indignation. Jae-hyun had always been trained not to show emotion in public, but something was different that night. Maybe it was the way she, even suffocated by shame, tried to maintain her dignity. Maybe it was the memory of his own youth, marked by losses he rarely shared. When Yunji stood up, hunched over and ready to leave, the glass he'd slammed down on the table still vibrated slightly from the impact. The room fell silent for a moment, but then the laughter resumed, as if the moment had been merely a minor noise. But for Jae-hyun, that sound was the beginning of an irrevocable decision. He couldn't allow the scene to end like this. And as Yunji walked towards the door, unaware that someone in power was watching her every step, Jae-hyun slowly adjusted his jacket, took a deep breath and stood up, ready to turn her humiliation into something no one would ever forget. Yunji was about to reach the door when the sharp voice of Seo Mi-young, one of the most influential socialites in Gangnam's circle, echoed through the room. Seated at a central table, surrounded by friends who followed her like shadows, she sported a shimmering dress and a sharp gaze that seemed to feed on the pain of others. With a mocking smile, she raised her wine glass and declared loudly for all to hear, "Look, even trash finds a way to invade places that don't belong to it." The laughter that followed was even more cruel than the previous one. The entire restaurant seemed to conspire against Yunji, as if she had committed the sin of crossing an invisible boundary, a social limit that could not be crossed by someone of her standing. Every glance that fell on her was like a silent sentence. "You don't belong here." The waiter, who had already shown disdain, approached again, this time more impatient. With a brusque gesture, he tried to push her out, muttering that he didn't want any trouble in a place frequented by important people. Yunji's purse fell to the floor, scattering coins and crumpled papers that tumbled across the shiny marble floor. People laughed louder, as if the scene were a comedy designed for their entertainment. Yunji knelt quickly, trying to gather her things, her face burning with shame. Her hands trembled as she put the coins back, and the tears she had fought to hold back finally began to flow. She tried to hide them, but it was impossible. The pain had overflowed. Seo Mi-young stood up, walked towards her with slow, measured steps, and leaning in so that everyone could see, whispered in a tone loud enough to echo throughout the hall. "You can dress however you want, you can pretend you belong here, but deep down, you'll still be just human trash." The comment was followed by a brief, awkward silence, as if even the restaurant's luxurious walls hesitated to absorb such cruelty. But soon after, the room erupted in renewed laughter, reinforcing the spectacle of humiliation. Yunji took a deep breath, clutching her bag to her chest, trying to muster the strength to get up and leave. She felt like every second there was an eternity of pain, yet something kept her from simply running. Maybe it was the memory of her mother's words about dignity being the greatest treasure. Maybe it was the wounded pride that, even shattered, still insisted on standing. While the room was having fun at her expense, a silent tension was growing in another part of the restaurant. Han Jae-hyun, still seated, he observed every detail. Intently, his hand firmly on the table, slowly clenched into a fist. He had already tolerated too much. This scene, which should have ended minutes ago, had become unbearable. The limit had been crossed. And it was at that moment, when Yunji believed there was no escape and that she would have to bear the shame of being expelled alone, that the sound of a chair scraping echoed across the marble floor, interrupting the laughter and freezing the air in the hall. All eyes turned in the same direction. A man had just stood up. The silence that fell over the restaurant was almost palpable. The sound of a chair scraping echoed like thunder amid the laughter that abruptly ceased. All eyes focused on the man who had stood up, Han Jae-hyun, imposing in his black suit, with a firm gaze and a posture that exuded authority. Many immediately recognized who he was, and a murmur ran through the room, like a wave across the surface of a lake. Yunji, still kneeling, her bag clutched to her chest, slowly looked up. When her eyes met his, for a moment the world seemed to stop. Jae-hyun walked toward her with firm steps, and with each movement the atmosphere grew denser, as if even the air had stopped to observe what would come next. Without hesitation, he leaned over, took Yunji's hand, and helped her to her feet. His gesture was simple, but filled with a strength no one dared question. In a deep, clear voice that echoed throughout the hall, he declared, "If she's trash, then so am I." The words hung in the air like a definitive sentence. The entire room fell silent, and for a few seconds the silence was so intense that the distant clink of a glass being placed on another table could be heard. Faces, previously filled with contempt, now displayed surprise, disbelief, and even fear. Jae-hyun then turned to the waiter, who remained paralyzed, and added firmly, "Bring the bill. For everyone. I'll pay." A collective gasp ran through the restaurant, as if no one believed what they had just heard. The elite, who minutes before had been laughing at Yunji, were now perplexed. Some tried to hide their embarrassment, others averted their eyes, unable to bear the scene. Seo Mi-young, in particular, stood motionless, her face hardened with the silent fury of someone who refused to be challenged in public. Meanwhile, Jae-hyun intertwined his fingers with Yunji's and naturally began walking toward the exit. Confused and still teary-eyed, she allowed herself to be guided, feeling the firmness of his hand like a safe haven amidst the chaos. Each step they took together was accompanied by stunned looks, as if the world had turned upside down in a matter of minutes. As they walked through the restaurant door, leaving behind the scene of humiliation, turned into a spectacle of courage. A murmur of low voices and whispers echoed among those present. No one would ever forget what had just happened. But for Yunji, the night was just beginning. Outside the restaurant, the chill of the Seoul night enveloped Yunji like a shock of reality. Still stunned by what had just happened, she could barely process the scene she'd just witnessed. Never in her life had anyone stood up for her like that, much less a man with such power and authority in his gaze. Her heart was pounding, not only from the still throbbing embarrassment, but from the strange sense of security conveyed by Jae-hyun's firm grip on her hand. He led her to a luxury car parked in front of the restaurant. The driver opened the door immediately, but Jae-hyun made a point of guiding her to the back seat gently, as if he were protecting something precious. Yunji hesitated, looking around, almost ready to refuse. Getting into vehicles that looked like something out of a luxury magazine wasn't part of her reality. Still, something in his voice convinced her. "Come in. Enough of today being treated like someone who doesn't belong anywhere." His words were firm but also filled with respect. As they drove silently through the illuminated streets of Seoul, Yunji didn't know where to put her hands or how to act. The reflection of the city in the windows seemed too distant from her simple reality. So, to break the silence, Jae-hyun asked, "What do you do? What's your story?" Surprised by her genuine interest, she briefly told him about her life in Incheon, her widowed mother, her sewing work, and her shy dream of opening a studio. Jae-hyun listened attentively, his eyes never leaving her. Every detail seemed to reinforce the impression he'd had when observing her. There was a dignity in her that no humiliation could erase. When they arrived in front of the small house where Eun-ji lived, he remained silent for a few seconds, as if pondering something important. Then, bluntly, he offered her a chance that sounded almost impossible. "You have talent. If you want, you can work at my company. I need someone who brings authenticity to our fashion industry." Yunji was shocked. Part of her wanted to believe in this opportunity, but another part suspected nothing so grand could be real. What if it was just charity? What if he saw her as a fleeting case of compassion? Even so, there was something in his gaze that conveyed sincerity. Before he could answer, Jae-hyun added in a calm tone, "Think carefully, but know that your life doesn't have to be limited to the humiliations you suffered today." And it was that night, as she closed the door behind her, that Yunji realized her life might be about to change. But what she didn't yet know was how powerful this decision would awaken against her. The days that followed were like a plunge into a completely new universe for Eun-ji. The opportunity Jae-hyun offered seemed unreal at first, but soon she found herself entering the imposing glass building that housed his company's headquarters in Seoul. The automatic doors opened before her like a threshold into a world she never imagined belonging to. At first, everything seemed intimidating. The main hall gleamed with marble floors. Executives hurried past with briefcases in hand, and well-dressed employees watched her curiously. With her simple posture and careful gaze, she seemed out of place in an environment where perfection and appearance were implicit requirements. But Jae-hyun, upon personally welcoming her, made a point of introducing her to the fashion department, explaining that she would bring an authentic look, born from real life. Yunji began by helping with small tasks, such as checking seams or offering feedback on fabrics. However, she soon gained attention for her sensitivity in noticing details that escaped the trained eyes of renowned designers. Where others saw only lines and cuts, she saw stories, emotions that could be translated into clothing. This authenticity surprised even the most skeptical, and gradually she went from being seen as an interloper to someone whose voice mattered. Jae-hyun, for his part, couldn't help but observe her every gesture. He liked the way Eun-ji spoke little, but when she did, her words carried sincerity. He noticed how she always thanked the security guards upon entering, or how she discreetly helped overworked colleagues. These were small details that fascinated him, perhaps because he himself was accustomed to a world where every gesture was calculated for advantage. Between meetings and lunch breaks, their closeness grew naturally. One day, Yunji unwittingly dropped colored threads on Jae-hyun's desk. Instead of complaining, he picked up one of the threads and asked with a small smile, "What color would you use to tell your own story?" She was speechless for a few seconds, surprised by the unexpected question. Then she answered honestly, "I think I would choose white, because it's simple, but it can also carry any tone that life brings." Jae-hyun was silent for a moment, as if reflecting on the depth of that answer. Gradually, their relationship became more than just professional. There were glances that lingered longer than they should have, silences that spoke volumes, and small gestures that revealed a growing concern. Yunji, however, tried to convince herself that it couldn't go any further. She felt torn between gratitude and the fear of deluding herself with a man who seemed to live in another universe. Still, there was something inevitable in the air, as if each step was leading them down a path neither of them would dare deny. For long. But just as trust was beginning to blossom, shadows were stirring behind the scenes. Those who couldn't stand to see a simple young woman occupy a place alongside one of the most powerful men in the country were already quietly plotting. And Yunji didn't yet know that she would soon face the cruel weight of envy and opposition. The brilliance of Yunji's progress within the company didn't go unnoticed. At first, some colleagues viewed her with suspicion, believing she wouldn't last more than a few days. However, when they saw that Jae-hyun trusted their opinions and even considered their creative suggestions, their curious looks quickly turned to resentment. For many, it was unacceptable that someone from such humble backgrounds would be placed alongside the most powerful man they knew. And among all those who harbored resentment, no one burned with more hatred than Seo Mi-young. The memory of the restaurant, of the moment Jae-hyun had stood up and, in front of everyone, chosen to protect Eun-ji instead of supporting her, gnawed at her day after day. For someone accustomed to being acclaimed at any social event, having her authority publicly questioned was a wound she wouldn't allow to heal. From then on, Yunji's every step was followed by his watchful, venomous eyes. It wasn't long before Mi-young began to act. Using her influence among socialites and business people, she spread rumors that Yunji was an opportunist, someone feigning humility just to win the CEO's heart. Tabloid journalists, always hungry for scandal, began publishing headlines insinuating that the young woman was Han Jae-hyun's new secret lover. Distorted photographs of mundane moments, like the two walking side by side or having lunch together in the company cafeteria, were presented as proof of a clandestine affair. The backlash was immediate. Employees murmured in the hallways, important clients began to question the company's image, and even directors close to Jae-hyun began to pressure him, claiming the company's reputation was at risk. All of this fell on Eun-ji like an unbearable burden. Even as she tried to maintain her composure, she felt the raw wounds of injustice. With every sly look, every spiteful whisper, the memory of her mother's words seemed to fade. As much as she tried to convince herself she was strong enough to endure, there were nights when she cried alone, suffocated by the fear of messing up the man who had believed in her when everyone else treated her like nothing. Jae-hyun, on the other hand, was increasingly determined to protect her. In private meetings, he made it clear that he would not accept insinuations against her. But this unwavering defense only further inflamed his enemies, who saw his insistence as a sign of weakness, an opening to be exploited. And in the midst of this crossfire, Yunji began to feel that however strong the feelings growing between them, perhaps the weight of their worlds was greater than her courage. Seo Mi-young, certain she was close to destroying the rival who had shamed her, devised one final coup. using the press and shareholders to force Jae-hyun to distance himself from Yunji or risk losing multi-million-dollar contracts. The noose was closing in, and the humble young woman found herself trapped between the blossoming love and the storm gathering around her. And it was in this whirlwind of accusations, scornful looks, and unbearable pressure that Yunji began to consider a painful decision. Perhaps the only way to protect him was to disappear. The following weeks became a veritable maze of anguish for Eun-ji. The more she tried to focus on work, the more she felt the sidelong glances and venomous whispers following her through the company corridors. The newspaper headlines became increasingly cruel, describing her as a feelings usurper, someone who took advantage of Jae-hyun's generosity to climb the social ladder. The weight of these words was crushing, and with each passing day, the feeling of being a burden to the man who championed her grew more suffocating. There were nights when Eun-ji lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small room, silent tears streaming down her face. The memory of her mother, always repeating that dignity was the greatest treasure, made her ponder. Was she truly being worthy by remaining by Jae-hyun's side while his reputation was being destroyed? Her heart burned with contradiction. On one hand, the intense desire to remain close to him. On the other, the conviction that love was also sacrifice, and perhaps the greatest act of love was to set him free. It was on a cloudy morning that he made the most painful decision of his life. He sat at the table, a plain sheet of paper before him. It took him a while to find the words, but when they came out as a stifled outburst. You deserve someone from your world, someone who won't tarnish your name, someone who will walk beside you without being a burden. I can only offer my regards, and that's why I choose to leave. In the end, he signed simply Yunji, and tears blurred some of the ink. She left the letter on his office desk in a discreet envelope and left the company without looking back. Each step was heavy, as if she were leaving not only a job, but also the chance for a different destiny, a love that was beginning to blossom. As she walked through the busy streets of Seoul, she seemed invisible among the crowds. But inside, she carried the pain of a broken heart. He returned to Incheon, to the same simple house, to the same neighborhood he'd always known. There, within familiar walls, he believed he could hide his pain. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself it was the right decision, his absence weighed heavily on every moment, like an open wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. On the other side, in Seoul, Jae-hyun would find that letter. And when his eyes scanned those tear-stained words, there would be no doubt. He would never allow the story to end like this. When Jae-hyun walked into his office that morning and found the envelope on his desk, a strange uneasiness ran through him even before he opened it. He recognized Eun-ji's delicate handwriting, and his heart, accustomed to controlled rhythms in business meetings, raced as if anticipating the pain he was about to feel. As he read each line, a feeling of emptiness filled his chest. The words spoke of renunciation, of sacrifice, of a desperate attempt to protect him, but to him it was all nothing more than an injustice to the love that refused to be silenced. The letter ended with a simple, almost resigned farewell, but to Jae-hyun it sounded like a stifled scream. He crumpled the paper in his hands and closed his eyes, allowing anger and determination to course through him. It wasn't just about him or Yunji. It was about confronting an entire system that insisted on defining who was and wasn't worthy of love. A few days later, Jae-hyun was invited to speak at one of Korea's largest business conferences, a nationally televised event attended by ministers, business people, and journalists. It was the kind of stage where every word carried political and financial weight. Many expected him to talk about innovation, investment, or international expansion, but Jae-hyun had already made up his mind. This would be the moment to speak his truth to everyone. The auditorium was packed. Cameras captured every detail, and photographers' flashes illuminated the scene as if it were a gala. When Jae-hyun took the stage, the audience rose in formal applause, but her gaze seemed to seek only one spot in the crowd. And there she was, Yunji, discreetly brought by one of his trusted drivers. Sitting in the back rows, she tried to remain invisible, never imagining that in a few minutes she would be the center of everything. Jae-hyun began his speech with his usual firmness, speaking briefly about values and social responsibility. But suddenly he interrupted his prepared script. He took a deep breath, let the silence weigh heavily for a few seconds, and looking directly at Yunji declared, "For weeks, the press has speculated about my personal life. They've made up stories, made accusations, but today I want to make it clear before all of you and before the country, the woman many dared to call a gold digger is, in fact, the only person who has ever shown me what true loyalty is." A buzz filled the auditorium. Journalists stirred. Cameras turned to find Yunji's face, and she, surprised, brought her hands to her face, unable to hold back the tears. Jae-hyun stepped off the stage, walked through the audience, and reached her. Before hundreds of incredulous eyes, he knelt before her, took her hand, and said, his voice thick with emotion, "There are no standards when it comes to love. Yunji is the woman I chose, and no amount of power, wealth, or tradition can make me back down from that decision." The hall erupted in murmurs, some in shock, others in subdued applause. The press recorded every second as if it were a historic event. For Yunji, the world was spinning too fast, but the only sound that mattered was his voice echoing in her soul. And as the audience watched in astonishment, it became increasingly clear that this public display of love wouldn't end the battle. On the contrary, it was merely the beginning of a new war against all who wouldn't see them together. The silence that fell over the auditorium after Jae-hyun's declaration was unlike any other. It was no longer a silence of contempt or humiliation, but a silence charged with impact, as if everyone there knew they were witnessing an unforgettable moment. Yunji's eyes, still teary, searched for an explanation, a way out, anything that would justify the man's almost insane courage in front of such a powerful audience. She tried to pull her hand away, embarrassed by the exposure, but Jae-hyun gently squeezed her fingers as if to say without words, "Trust me." And in that instant, everything around her faded into insignificance. The cameras, the journalists, the murmurs, nothing existed but the two of them. Yunji felt her heart race, not with fear, but with recognition. This was the man who had seen her when everyone else ignored her, who had lifted her up when everyone else had pushed her to the ground. With silent tears streaming down her face, Yunji finally allowed herself to respond to his gesture, not with grandiose words but with a simple nod, a look that spoke louder than 1,000 promises. It was the acceptance of a fate she had tried to refuse, but which now became inevitable. The audience, sensing the outcome, began to applaud. At first timid, then intense, the applause filled the auditorium, breaking down once and for all the barriers of prejudice that had seemed insurmountable just minutes before. Among those present, there were still disgruntled faces, looks that refused to accept the breaking of social conventions, but Jae-hyun's courage had become greater than his resistance. There, before everyone, he showed that love was not weakness, but the greatest of strengths. That same night, away from the cameras, Yunji and Jae-hyun walked side by side down a quiet Seoul street. He didn't bring flowers or prepare any speeches, just took a small, simple, unostentatious silver ring from his pocket and said, "I don't need luxuries to prove what I feel. I just want you to walk with me, regardless of what the world says." Yunji, overcome with emotion, accepted the ring with trembling hands. It wasn't a symbol of wealth, but of promise, of truth, of a new beginning. And in that moment, she knew that no matter how many battles lay ahead, their love had already won the greatest of them all. But while they believed they could finally breathe in peace, something still awaited them on the horizon. A new page in their lives was about to be written, and with it would come a message capable of touching not only their hearts, but also the hearts of all who believed that true love could flourish even in the most barren lands. A few months had passed since that cold night in Gangnam, where a woman's dignity was wounded, but also where one of the most touching stories the city has ever witnessed was born. Jae-hyun's unexpected gesture, paying everyone's bill and leaving hand in hand with Yunji, was headline news everywhere. What was supposed to be just another passing high society scandal turned into something no one could ignore, a landmark of public, human, and quietly revolutionary transformation. For weeks, Yunji was the target of tabloid media, portrayed as an opportunist, accused of creating a scene, as if her genuine pain wasn't enough to justify her reaction. But public opinion soon began to shift, not because of public defenses or formal statements, but because of the firm, calm, and dignified stance she maintained in the face of each attack. He didn't give interviews, he didn't seek applause, he just kept on living. Little by little, the headlines began to change their tone. The image of that young woman holding hands with one of the country's most respected CEOs stopped being a source of gossip and began to represent something many people needed to remember: that true love does not choose status, and that courage can come even from calloused hands. It was with this spirit that Yunji decided to reopen the old community workshop in the Incheon neighborhood where she grew up. It was a simple space with peeling bricks and wooden floors, but full of memories. There, her mother had taught her her first stitches when she was still a child, dreaming of new clothes. Now, that same space had become a living atelier where humble young people, girls and boys with still shy eyes, learned to transform fabric into hope. Yunji was no longer just a seamstress. She was a mentor, a friend, a symbol of resilience and humility. He taught the basics patiently, but most importantly, he made a point of repeating the same phrase at the end of each class. What you wear doesn't define who you are. How you treat others, that's what defines your true worth. On the workshop walls, drawings made by the students filled every empty space. There were colorful sketches, messages written with markers, cutouts stuck together with tape. Everything was improvised and therefore authentic. Each small poster carried a story, a dream, a desire to be seen. And each of these desires was embraced by Yunji like embroidery that, little by little, helped mend the wounds the world left open. Jae-hyun, despite his position and busy schedule, visited the workshop whenever he could. He never gave advance notice. He arrived unguarded, discreetly, and sat on a wooden bench in the back of the room, simply observing. He didn't say who he was. He didn't ask for attention. He didn't make speeches. He just watched, fascinated. To him, every gesture Eun-ji made with her students, every attentive look she gave a newcomer, every time she bent down to help a child hold a needle, all of that was the greatest lesson he had ever received in life. It was there, on that simple Incheon floor, that he disconnected from the pressure, the contracts, the appearances. He felt that, with Yunji by his side, he didn't have to prove anything to anyone. He could just be. One such afternoon, the sunset bathed the workshop windows in orange and gold, hues creating warm reflections that danced across the fabrics. Yunji was finishing hemming a dress to one of the girls when she felt Jae-hyun's presence approaching from behind. He said nothing. He simply held her hand, as he always did. She turned, and upon meeting his eyes, she smiled tenderly. It was a smile without masks, without haste, without unrealistic promises. It was a smile that said, "I'm here, we're still here, and that's enough." They left the workshop and walked together through the quiet streets of the neighborhood. Like any ordinary couple, they sat on the steps of the school where Yunji had studied, watched the streetlights begin to light up, and heard the voices of children playing in the distance. Jae-hyun, looking at the slowly darkening sky, said softly, "Sometimes I think I had to build entire empires to find you. And in the end, it was you who taught me what it means to have something truly valuable." Yunji leaned her head on his shoulder and replied in a whisper, "What we build with our hands may disappear, but what we build with our hearts remains forever." That night, there was no audience, no reporters, no crowd, but for them, it was the most important scene of all. Two hearts that recognized each other, even across worlds so far apart, and that decided not only to love each other, but live as if love were the revolution itself. Yunji and Jae-hyun's story wasn't marked by fairy tales or exaggerated statements. It was marked by courage, by understood silences, by holding hands amidst the storm. It was a true story, like so many others that almost go unnoticed, but which carry within them the beauty of those who choose good, even when everything seems to invite indifference. And if this story touched your heart, don't let it fade away here. Subscribe to the channel to receive more stories that celebrate the love that endures, the faith that is reborn, and the hope that, even when wounded, never surrenders. Like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that being simple is not a flaw, is strength, and that love, when true, doesn't need to shine. He just needs to stay.